You have the floor.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me. I'm very delighted and honored to be here. And last year I was a research fellow at Freie University. I participated in the program called Academy in Exile, which is also a telling name. So taking the context. Today I'm going to talk about a research paper or the findings of a research paper that is still in progress. So I'm very open to your comments, feedbacks, and I do hope that I won't confuse you with my presentation. I start now. I'm going to share my screen with you. Okay, so the title of my presentation is Saint or Sinner, the Instrumentalization of Gender in Moral Geopolitics, Lessons from Hungary. And I immediately have to correct a little bit myself because I'm not the only one who is working on this topic. I'm writing this paper with Gergely Csányi, who is one of my colleagues. And our approach on what happened to gender studies in Hungary and what are the factors behind the anti-gender politics in Hungary. We take a word system theory approach on analyzing these issues. So let me show you a quote that I chose for having it today as the motto of my presentation. It is from Katalin Koncz, who was the former head of the Women's Studies Center at the Hungarian Corvinus University, used to be University of Economics. This quotation is from 2006, and this quotation is in a book, a collection of recollections about the history of local gender studies and gender research in Hungary. The quotation is the following: establishing the Women's Studies Center, the very first in Hungary, was an important step for both the nation and the university. It contributed to the adaptation of European norms and created an organizational and intellectual basis on which EU requirements could be built. And I find this quotation very telling because it is saying actually that the institutionalization of gender studies in Hungary can be analyzed and can be approached as a political, cultural hegemony building process as part of a Europeanization or Westernization process. And I think that the fact that these words are actually highlighted to requirements tells us that if we elaborate why and how the institutionalization of gender studies could become the part of these Europeanization and Westernization processes, and what are the structural factors behind these processes, then it might be easier to understand why gender studies as a discipline and why gender scholars could become a political target recently in Hungary, and not just in Hungary, but in other Eastern European countries. So our research question, some parts or some of our research questions are already explored in the literature. We started our analysis from this question: what does gender and gender studies symbolize for the opponents and the supporters in Hungary? This question, as I'm going to show you soon, this question is already explored and already answered and elaborated in the literature. Just as if I connect now the institutionalization of gender studies to the existence and the operation of certain moral and political values in the region and in the country, we can ask the question: what moral interested in more in these questions are not that researched and not that discussed in the literature. So we found this gap in the existing knowledge, that how did gender and gender studies become a moral category and an instrument of moral geopolitics in Hungary. I am going to define what moral geopolitics is soon. And so this question was only partly explored in the literature, but what was totally unexplored was that what kind of structural forces have influenced this process, and how can we reconstruct and understand this process through examining the local history of gender studies. And you might ask the question, why should we care about the ideas, why it has got something to do with why gender studies became a political target if we are not gender scholars? And my answer to this question is that, and actually this is our argument in this future paper, that the arrival of gender as an academic concept and as an analytical tool to the Hungarian academia and civil activism from the Western academia, and the local history of gender studies actually can be analyzed as part of a global hegemony building process and a hegemony transition process. We are going to approach the concept of hegemony on a Gramscian basis. That means it is not just a cultural hegemony building process, but also political and economic. And local elite and intellectual groups are playing important and significant role in this reintegration process that started in the 1970s and 1980s and then continued and intensified in the 1990s and the 2000s. And gender studies and the knowledge that is embedded and presented and gained through gender studies played a significant role in this reintegration process and hegemony building process. Because the different institutionalized forms of this gender knowledge, like universities, programs, research centers, were part of this hegemony building, knowledge in the gender knowledge in this sense. And therefore, the activity or the agency of the local gender scholars, researchers, and activists, or gender policy experts, it is crucial to be analyzed because their agency, which was shaped and limited by different structural forces that I'm going to show you, but still contributed to this hegemony building process. Therefore, the termination of the gender studies MA programs, so not just the institutionalization or the birth of the gender studies, but the termination of the gender studies MA programs shall be also analyzed as part of a global hegemony or restructuring or a global hegemony transition process. So these are the key concepts of my presentation. And I'm going to not just define them, just to be on the same page, what we all should know and think about these concepts, but I am also going to highlight the relations between these concepts and how they are related, or how we are relating them with my co-author when we are analyzing what happened to gender studies and why gender studies and gender scholars and gender knowledge as such became a political target in Hungary. So first of all, I would like to define or clarify what do we mean by hegemony on a Gramscian basis. So as I told you, we should approach the concept of hegemony not just in a cultural sense, but also in an economic sense. And by hegemony, we mean those global structures, unequal structures of division of labor, global division of labor, and the related unequal exchanges of resources between states, and regions in the country or in the world actually, but these global structures are always, as Gramsci said, are always resulted after a long compromise-making process. So their stability and the existence of these structures are always a result of compromise between elite groups. In order to have a hegemonic situation like a world order, it is required that certain cultural norms should be there, because these cultural norms justify these practices, these hegemony building processes. So it is inevitable and crucial to construct a knowledge that justifies the existence of hegemony, and not just justifies, but in some sense pacify different social groups to accept that hegemony in the society or on a world scale, and reproduce this kind of knowledge constantly. From time to time, the hegemonic positions of certain states or regions come to be questioned, and this is the time when the old hegemony starts fading away, and a new hegemony structure is building, or somehow it is constructed on the ruins of the old hegemony. During the hegemonic transition, the old hegemony collapses. The old hegemony means the existing political and cultural world order. New configurations of power structures emerge. And of course, this process of crisis and breakdown of the old hegemony and building up the new hegemony, it is always surrounded by social conflicts between different elite groups in the society and their representatives. Certain cultural norms that justifies the existence of a certain hegemony. The cultural and knowledge-based justification can go through with the so-called concepts of academic imperialism or linked to the concepts of academic imperialism and academic dependency. By academic imperialism, we mean in a very easy and simple way, the domination of one people over another in the world of thinking. But academic imperialism practically refers to the control and the management of these so-called colonized regions. This kind of control and management requires the application of various social scientific disciplines. So Alatas, who invented this term, had a background in colonial theories and post-colonial theories, and he applied the academic imperialism to describe, for example, the processes of how social scientific knowledge flows from Western regions to Eastern regions, or from the global North to the global South. And Alatas also links this the idea of academic imperialism to the concept of academic dependency. By academic dependency, we mean the idea that, for example, the social sciences in the intellectually dependent societies are dependent on the institutions and ideas of Western social sciences. So what does it mean, for example, when the concept of gender arrived to Hungary and other Eastern European countries? There was no terminology and no vocabulary around gender knowledge or gender studies. There was already research about the relationship, the unequal relationship between men and women, for example. and other related topics, but actually the term wasn't there. It was somewhere else. And then the term traveled to these regions, but of course, not just only the concept traveled, but different academic institutions as such, and not just the concepts, but also theories, frames, methods, certain research topics that was not there before, and funds and infrastructure, because this kind of knowledge building required infrastructure. However, that time, in the 1980s, 1990s, in the Eastern European countries, in the academia, there was no really resource to build research centers and to have a prosperous academic life in the middle of the change of regime and transition processes. The third key concept of our research, in which we analyze what happened to gender studies in the past and in the present, is the the concept of developmental idealism. The developmental idealism is a cultural model. So we should approach it as a kind of cultural model, an ideology that normalizes development as a goal without questioning the actual content of the concept of what it means, what development means, what is the actual content of the concept. So developmental idealism refers to a set of beliefs and values that identifies the appropriate goals of development. For example, when a country is posed to the verdict that the level of gender equality is not as high as it should be, the country needs to catch up to other countries where gender equality is better, or the quality of gender equality is better. And it also assigns the proper tools for achieving these targets and aims. So developmental idealism is not just simply about setting up development as a norm, but it also development as a norm, but also it defines what are the proper tools to achieve it and have it. This idea that added or grasped by the developmental idealism concept, it leads us to the concept of moral geopolitics. Moral geopolitics refers to the invention and the construction and these processes through which these inventions and constructions are happening. So the invention and construction of regions, certain geographical regions, by applying a moralizing narrative and a discourse. So from an Eastern European perspective, Western Europe will be constructed as the morally good, while Eastern Europe will be the bad one. When I'm sure you, if you are familiar with these different narratives, I'm sure I won't tell you something new about how it is a well-known and very inherent narrative in Eastern European countries that Eastern European countries should catch up with the West, economically or culturally. It is the manifestation of a so-called East-West slope, moral slope, as Attila Meleg phrases it. This kind of narrative that certain regions are morally, economically, culturally, or politically, or in any other virtuous way are better than others, and the others should catch up. It is very frequent that local elite groups are applying these narratives and discourses, which will become then part of a kind of social colonization process. So when local intellectuals are saying that we are not good as we should and we are not good as those in the West. And of course, by applying these narratives, these local elite groups can express a kind of social class habitus. They also express that they more belong, according to their perception, they more belong to their Western counterparts, to the Western middle and upper class, instead of
Let's give Anikó a bit of time to recover the connection here. In case you have questions, also for clarification, you can also post them into the chat.
Says gender studies.
Anikó, we've had a long interruption. Maybe you can repeat like the last idea.
Okay, this one, like the more geopolitics. Okay, sorry.
Half a minute interruption.
Okay. So as I told you, this narrative within the moral geopolitical frame about how certain regions are morally better than other ones and how other regions are morally worse than the others, it is usually applied by the local elite groups. Or one can observe that local elite groups are quite likely to apply these narratives, which is defined as a kind of self-colonization, if we use the terminology of Kiosev. And during these narratives, these social classes express not just their social class habitus, but also the belonging of themselves to their Western middle or upper class counterparts. So it is more about expressing their closeness, cultural and habitual closeness to their Western counterparts, while they can distance themselves from local working class people, for example. So if I apply these four concepts and I go back to our argument about the local history and the anti-gender incidents, then we can approach these incidents within the following framework. So during the global restructuring and the political, economic, cultural reintegration process, gender studies, with its special relation to policy making, for example, but not just exclusively, but it was very crucial in this process, gender studies and gender knowledge served as a scientifically authorized mediator of cultural values. So through concepts, through theories, and especially through research agendas, what kind of social problems it problematized and scholars problematized during their research, like many researchers conducted their research about managerial women, or how to break the glass ceiling, which problematized the situation of upper middle class or upper class women, for example, while there was no such research about working class women. I mean, I'm not saying that the glass ceiling question is the most important thing of working class women, but the working conditions of working class women was much rarely discussed in the literature. So, so gender studies served as a mediator of knowledge and cultural values. And in this reintegration process, the adoption of Western knowledge and these knowledge structures became crucial to justify these political, economic, cultural reintegration processes in the region. And the narrative of catching up became prevalent, and the catching up of the region became required and inevitable, or constructed as inevitable. And therefore, dealing with gender studies and as a Western and progressive theory was easy to be framed as a progressive, enlightened knowledge that tied its practitioners to the West. So this is our main theoretical idea. I told you that there are already thousands of articles in which the authors try to explain why these anti-gender incidents and mobilizations or attacks and framings happen all around the world. So it is a global phenomenon. And we can make a distinction between three different groups of explanations. The first group of explanation, I call it as a backlash narrative or a backlash explanation. This group, which is the most frequent, if you take a look at and conservative, religious, traditionalist, illiberal, far right or right wing or populist, etc. Groups are attacking or stigmatizing or opposing or setting up a war against gender. And this is a universal backlash against already achieved rights, let them be women's rights or LGBT rights, and it is a backlash against fundamental progressive, it is an attack against fundamental progressive values like equality, human dignity, human rights, or democracy. The problem with these understandings are that, is that they frame these events in a culturalist frame, and they apply a kind of modernization theory approach that is saying that there is a linear progress in the development of these societies, and this development somehow gets stuck. So that kind of developmental idealism is a narrative that can be found in the basis of this backlash argumentations and explanations. And if we take this group of explanation, then these explanations are saying that this kind of catch-up process in the Eastern European region to the West somehow gets stuck, and these anti-gender incidents are clear signs of this backsliding and retraditionalism. The second group of explanation is saying that gender in these anti-gender incidents works as a symbolic glue that symbolizes many things in these societies. So it is not these attacks and these anti-gender discourses on the surface, they are about gender. But if you dig deeper, then it comes out that gender is just a symbol that symbolizes many things in these discussions. What does it symbolize? Gender symbolizes the failure of the promise of this catching up progressive project, political and economic project of the last 30 years, especially in the East Central European region, but not just there, elsewhere too. Gender works as a symbolic glue because it unifies otherwise different groups and topics. First of all, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, activism, and people. Also, this discourse unifies LGBT issues with different kind of feminisms and feminist activism. It unifies also them with different gender equality policies, the idea of equality between men and women, even if some of these unified elements are in a contradiction with each other, or they have very serious disputes and debates around certain issues. You can think about the arguments between feminists and LGBT people on many different terms, including surrogate motherhood or surrogacy, and similar topics. But gender not just unifies these otherwise different groups, but it is also unifies otherwise different groups among the so-called opponents. So the coalition of religious, right-wing, far-right, or even some kind of parental groups are united against gender. So it is a very easy and very handy tool for political mobilization, because the topic unites the otherwise different groups among the opponents. And gender, according to this explanation, gender serves as a link in an association chain when gender becomes part of this association chain that can be accused of the failure of this catching up development and processes and losing national sovereignty. So gender becomes equal to EU, Brussels, the liberals. Gender will symbolize individualism, human rights, the project of open society, internationalism, etc. So there is an association chain. And there are other literatures that are saying that gender will be used as the symbol of anti-family values. So in countries where feminism becomes the modus operandi of the state operation, then it is quite handy to use gender as expressing this anti-family idea. So therefore, anti-gender can express a pro-family idea. And it is happening in Hungary and Poland. This explanation is saying that there is a cacophony around the multiple and contradictory meanings of gender. Actually, there are a lot of existing meaning now on gender. Some people say that now it is quite difficult to use the term, because in this room, if I would ask you, or if I asked you to define gender, I'm sure we would have 30, 40 different definitions, because it is almost personalized. And but the problem with this approach is that the focus is much more on understanding the opponents and the anti-gender politics, instead of looking for the possible agency of gender or gender studies or gender scholars or other factors that made gender to become an easy target to an extent. Of course, my point is not a kind of victim blaming. I am also criticized by these anti-gender voices. I'm just saying that let's be a little bit more self-reflective about ourselves. And the third group of explanation why these anti-gender events happening, it focuses much more on the agency of gender, gender knowledge, gender, the concept, and gender people. It is saying that this cacophony around the meanings of gender, in some cases, the meaning of gender is frequently limited to partial meanings, like gender identity, and therefore it is quite easy from the opponent's side to argue that gender is only about identity and only about individual issues, and changing gender means that you can change actually your gender from one day to another, because in certain policy documents it is there, and some activism is fighting for things like that. And another very interesting article about Poland highlighted that, for example, if we take a look at how the different gender mainstreaming policies were implemented during the EU accession processes in the early 2000s, then actually the implementation happened in a top-down and technocratic manner. Therefore, it was quite easy to frame gender and gender mainstreaming as a process that damaged the national sovereignty of Poland, and it was something that was undemocratically forced on Poland with the support of local feminists and gender experts. So I really like this article that highlighted this one. So to go back to the role of gender, gender knowledge, and gender studies in becoming a political target in Hungary, I would start with the idea that gender is usually described as a traveling concept in the humanities, and it means that there are certain concepts in the the scientific knowledge that is growing out in a certain context and then travels to other parts of the world, and this traveling has certain consequences on the concept and how we can use them and apply them in certain contexts. Gender as a traveling concept, this travel resulted in a production of standardized knowledge. So the term, as it is argued in this article, the term has been often decontextualized and disconnected from local specificities. So it becomes a standard knowledge, a standard concept that should fit in the local specificities without taking into account what these local specificities are. So it is constructing and producing a standardized knowledge, even in context, certain social contexts, when the application of the term would be irrelevant or not that feasible. We cannot ask the question, where does this standardized knowledge come from, or what is the purpose of this knowledge production? We just simply use the concept and apply it. And of course, it goes back to the idea of this academic imperialism and academic dependency, because it is saying that when gender is entering or was entering traveled to the Eastern European region, it was more a one-way traffic of knowledge, applying theories, vocabularies, concepts from the West, and therefore gender was immediately associated with Western Europe or democracies or liberal democracies, because it was a concept that came from that area. It is also another very interesting thing to see what happened to gender recently. So immediately when gender arrived to a certain social context, it will work back there, but it won't lose its ties to the core regions where it was born. And what we can see in the core countries in Western academia is that there was a neoliberal turn, and there is a neoliberal turn in gender scholarship from the 2000s, in which the dominance of individual identity-based approaches can be observed, which means that if it links between the Eastern region and the Western region, it means that these changes in the core will happen in the Eastern region when we apply this concept and use it.
Anikó, just a second.
Yep.
Just a second. There was an interruption
Yeah.
when you were when you started mentioning the neoliberal turn in gender scholarship.
Okay.
Maybe you can repeat that again.
Yeah. So in the 2000s, according to this literature, one can observe a change in gender scholarship in the Western academia, namely that there was a neoliberal turn. And it meant that the dominance of individual identity-based approaches gained much more part in knowledge making than it used to have before. And the problem with it is that when it happens in the core, gender research and gender knowledge production in the Eastern European region need to adjust and focus on what is going on in Western literatures and Western academia. Therefore, this change also happened and has consequences on the Eastern European gender research and the ideas. So to put it in a nutshell, the early history of gender in Hungary, what we should know about it is that the term arrived in the 1970s, but it became widespread in the 1980s, and the arrival of the term went through the spheres of humanities and cultural studies. And that was the time when postmodern and post-structural theories became very important in the gender scholarship in Western Europe, and it affected strongly how gender was theorized and introduced as part of cultural studies. What I would like to highlight here is that gender scholars was not in an easy position in Hungary in the 1980s and the 1990s. That was the time when a very serious anti-feminist discourse went on. There was an internal hostility and disdain from the traditional academia sphere. So it gave them a kind of prestige in the 1990s when gender as a Western concept, a Western knowledge became more widespread, and it helped them to express that their status within the academia is not that or shouldn't be disdained by their colleagues. And of course, it helped them to keep a distance from state socialist past, because gender knowledge was something more and something better than the state socialist gender equality policies. It was something different compared to the state socialist idea. In social sciences, there was, as I told you, there was gender research before the arrival of the term gender, but it was also very important that since gender was arrived to Hungary as a cultural, merely cultural concept, it was quite difficult to understand the ongoing structural changes and how they affected the situation of men and women in the society in terms of structural, in structural terms and structural senses. The problem was that class as an analytical concept became practically outdated, and there was an antipathy towards class as an analytical tool. So there was, in social sciences, practically there was no conceptual tool, not even in gender, not even in other terms, to grasp those structural changes and the difficulties in the society. However, there become some dominant topics like the representation of elite women, women in politics, managerial women, women in boards or in decision making. These topics became very important in the 1990s, but again, it focused more on elite women and middle and upper class women. Another important part of the institutionalization of gender studies and why gender studies became associated with Western politics and Western democratic values and liberal values was the establishment and the foundation of CEU, which was a US-based private university, and it symbolized this pro-Western educational reform, part of a Westernization and EUization process. It symbolized the progressive academic and political project in the region. And this was the most important and dominant pillar of teaching and researching gender and gender studies in Hungary. So you could say that gender studies or teaching gender studies was equal to the CEU. And it became a very strong and very important hub for Hungarian feminist and LGBT activists. So it was quite easy to associate gender ambiguous among local gender scholars, because of course not all of them teach that CEU, but they use the infrastructure because CEU as a private university had much more and better infrastructure than local universities. But these local
Anikó,
scholars also argue. Yep.
Sorry, just another interruption. We've lost you when you were mentioning something very important about gender being associated with, and then there was a very long interruption.
Yeah. Sorry. So gender became associated with this progressive academic and political project, this pro-Western educational reform. Gender was associated with CEU and as part of the Westernization and EUization project. So it was also very important how gender and gender scholars and gender students there were associated with this whole project, whole political project. And the evaluation of the presence of CEU was quite ambiguous among local scholars. So they were quite grateful for the infrastructure and the library, and they are still they still praises this infrastructure. But at the same time, local scholars who teach at Hungarian universities said that they felt that CEU provided more a kind of import of American feminist discourse, and they didn't understand why using Judith Butler as a #1 reference would be important in the Hungarian context. So they also raised their concerns. And at public universities, practically there were tiny little, if there was any resource to set up gender research centers or groups, they were mostly voluntarily, without any institutional funding. Therefore, the importance of foreign funds like Soros Foundation or British Council or Western governments was very important. So even within the public universities, gender studies was associated with foreign donors and foreign funds and foreign organizations that supported gender studies, because there was no internal resource for that. And the EU accession just intensified these processes, because the European Union, as the promoter of progressive values like gender equality, funded some projects and funded some research centers. But again, the framing of these gender research and the different topics that were important from the EU perspective didn't meet necessarily to the local problems of Hungarian women. So there was money for studying and researching how women can go back to the labor market, but there was no research funding for researching what are the working conditions there and what are the different class inequalities among women. And to finish my presentation, this is going to be my last slide before I sum up. It is also important to see that the so-called gender pioneers, those academic feminists and activists who were active in the 1990s and who were actively involved in different international feminist circles, their presence and their role was also made them to be associated with international forces who are trained then as local actors of post-socialist entrepreneurs of the concept of gender. However, in many cases, these women who were trained and then that they brought back the knowledge to Hungary highlighted that in these trainings and meetings, the experience of Eastern European women was totally misunderstood by their Western counterparts. So to close down, as I told you, then the history of the institutionalized gender studies in East Central Europe and in Hungary is strongly intertwined with the different political, economic, and cultural processes of the global restructurings in the 1980s, 1990s, and 2000s. So there is no surprise that gender and gender studies are associated with progressive restructuring, and therefore it was quite easy to frame it as a symbol of failure. And just to close down my presentation, because I was talking about building new hegemony. As you know, CEU was forced to leave to Vienna. Now they started their academic year in Vienna. However, the Chinese Fudan University will start its operation soon in Budapest. So a US university was swiped out, and the Chinese university was invited. And this is a clear sign, I think, of a new hegemony building. So that was my presentation. Sorry for being a little bit long, and I know that it was quite condensed and full of